tonight's webinar is going to focus on the large-scale, multi-year, multi-stakeholder Upper Elk Valley Invasive Plant Management Project. Just as Bailey has mentioned, just so you know, and as a reminder, this is being recorded and will be posted online and available to watch anytime. I'll also email it out to the Elk Valley listserv as well, so that can be kind of circulated to anyone who wants to see the update too. So I've met all of you, but just so you know, I'm Danny Smart, the Field Operations Coordinator with East Kootenay Invasive Species Council. We also have Bailey Repp, ECIS Education and Communication Coordinator on the line. Before we dive into the main aspect of the webinar, I wanted to acknowledge that we're fortunate to live and work in the traditional and unceded territory of the Ktunaxa and Secwepemc peoples, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work in this territory. So I'm sure especially you folks are very well versed in the virtual world by now, but just as a reminder, please stay muted unless you have a question, just so that we can limit the background noise. If you do have a question throughout the presentation, feel free to speak up and hopefully we can answer it for you. So the agenda tonight is that I'll begin by providing a really brief overview of ECISC and the role we play in the region. This will move us into how and why the project came about, what was achieved in 2020, which was year 1 of the project, what has been achieved so far in year 2 of the project, and then next steps moving forward. And then after that, I'll pass it off to Bailey and she'll provide a bit of background on some invasive species, as well as some basic plant identification specific to the project. So the next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So ECIS is a regional nonprofit organization that works to mitigate the negative economic, environmental, and social impacts of invasive species in the East Kootenay. We're one of around 15 regional invasive species organizations in the province. Each one is involved in varying levels of on-the-ground work. So we have 4 purposes. The first one is to coordinate management. So we work with land managers to coordinate invasive species management at a landscape level. We complete a lot of fee-for-service work and deliver management of treatments. Just to note that we are not a land manager and we do not set priorities or make management decisions. Rather, we assist land managers with achieving their invasive species management goals and coordinate management between adjacent managers and increase efficiencies. The second one is education. So we're the main delivery agency for invasive species education and outreach in the East Kootenay. We provide workshops kind of similar to this one this evening, training, education, operations, and provide resources. The third one is we foster increased support. So we work to spread the word and increase support and capacity for invasive species management. And then the final one is prevention. So we do all of this work to prevent the introduction of new occurrences and spread of existing invasive species within the region. So the next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So with this in mind, in September 2019, ECIS met with various land managers and local user groups to discuss the growing concern of invasive species and their impacts to wild spaces in the Elk Valley, specifically the impacts they may have on available forage in what was regarded as a relatively clean or invasive-free and rich in biodiversity valley compared to other areas in the district. So the project area is shown on the map. I hope you can kind of see it. It does cover from the Alberta border in the north to approximately 80 kilometers south of Elkford. The project area is largely comprised of public land. So that includes land managers such as BC Parks, Ministry of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development, Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure right-of-ways, and the Nature Trust of BC's Big Ranch Conservation Property. There are also tracts of private land in the project area, so that includes folks like Tech Resource Limited lands and Camwell Fibre. So in 2019, local groups contributed funds which enabled us to work with West Fork Management and Vast Resources to develop an invasive plant management plan and proposals. And then following that, we secured funds primarily through Habitat Conservation Trust Foundation, Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program, and Columbia Basin Trust to begin work in the area. So next slide, please. Thank you. So within those applications, we outlined the specific goals shown on the screen. So the first one is to minimize and contain the presence of invasive plant species in the Upper Elk Valley, with an emphasis on areas of high habitat value, largely focusing on bighorn sheep habitat. And then the next one was to work collaboratively and increase stewardship as a multi-stakeholder group. Next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So just to give a bit of a timeline of kind of what's been going on. So over the winter of 2019 and 2020, as I just mentioned, we were successful at securing funding from CBT, HCTF, and FWCP. And then we had additional support from FLMRO, MOTI, BC Parks, and NTBC to implement year one of the project. In 2020, we focused on extended our knowledge of the area and inventoried about 330 kilometers of right-of-ways and treated about 52 kilometers of that. We also installed 10 permanent plots and various photo plots across the region, just so that we could gain a baseline data of our successes or failures over the lifespan of the project, as well as to inform us if we needed to change our management strategy over time. In addition to that, we did implement a really small seeding trial in a heavily infested area and conducted an information session similar to this one this evening as well. And then over the winter of 2020 and 2021, we were again successful at securing a large amount of funding to begin large-scale treatments in the project area. So to date, we have revisited all of the permanent monitoring plots and photo plots, conducted a few additional inventories in the area. We installed a couple of extra permanent plots as well, and then a large amount of the funding has been utilized for chemical treatments. So the next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So I hope you can all see that. I should have changed the color of the kind of travel treatment areas. So my apologies, but we can try and zoom in if we need to. So this year we worked with BDK Resources to conduct the treatment. And so the map highlights the areas that received treatment in 2021. Just to outline as well, these are routes traveled by BDK Resources. It's not necessarily everywhere that has received a large amount of treatments. Not every area is heavily infested with weeds. Some may even be weed free, but I wanted to highlight the areas accessed this year just to show you the scale of the project. So focal areas for treatments, again, included similar to year one, was roads that were scheduled for deactivation by FLMRO, high value wildlife areas, Forest Service roads, and recreation trails. So this year we have been able to treat all species within the project area with the exception of Canada thistle and oxeye daisy. These species are typically just not treated at the provincial level because of their just vast distribution. And so this year we're really hoping to have made a good dent in the infestations, and I'm super hopeful to continue moving forward, moving toward a cleaner valley over the next few years. I also wanted to mention just at the bottom there, the Nature Trust of BC also has an ecosystem enhancement project on the Big Ranch conservation property, which does lie within the project area. NTBC contracted ECAS to conduct chemical treatments at known sites from the 2020 inventory. I can't speak to the continuation of that project, but we are hopeful that both the Elk Valley IPMP and NTBC's project will continue to work together in future years. Did anyone want to zoom in on any area specifically to highlight anything, or is that map kind of okay? I can also circulate this too. Cool, not hearing anything. So I'm gonna move on. So the next slide, please. So next steps, we still have a few items to wrap up for the year. One piece is that we're still hoping to install invasive species signage at certain locations. I'm still looking into approval from land managers and finalizing the design. The image on the screen is just to provide an example of what the sign could look like. So the current locations that I have in mind are the Big Ranch Conservation Complex, Elk Lakes Provincial Park parking lot, and Crossing Creek Trailhead. Over the remaining lifespan of the project, I am really hopeful that we can install additional signs at other high use areas as well. And then over the winter, we'll be writing a final report for the project, as well as applying to FWCP and HCTF again for funding to continue the project. I'll also continue reaching out to various stakeholders to continue our partnership and collaboration efforts. And I'm really hoping that we can make a significant impact into the infestations in the project area. So that is, you can just pop to the next slide. It's just that's all of the update, a really brief update that I have on the project. Has anyone got any questions or specific kind of comments or concerns or anything that they wanted to ask or address?
I have a question, Danny, just regarding the yellow hawkweed. Did you guys, are you guys treating it in some areas of the Elk Valley now?
We are, yeah. Brad was pretty confident that he could kind of treat a large portion of it. So he's been doing that, kind of working north to south with it. And it's going really well. And he's just finalizing a few areas in the Todd Hunter AMA at the moment.
Well, that's good. Yeah. I mean, I know it wasn't very dense up the further north you go. So I think, yeah, I think that's a good strategy for sure. And yeah, the further south you go, it's everywhere.
Yeah, it's started to, but he was pretty confident with what he could get done, and he's achieved quite a lot. So yeah, it's been good so far, and we'll see how it looks next year and kind of what we can do in future years.
Perfect.
Hey Danny, you mentioned you guys set up a bunch of plots, and are the plots associated with the seeding trial, or can you elaborate a bit more on what the seeding trial is about?
Yeah, it was a really small trial that we just started last year, just in one area, just dense in yellow hawkweed. We do have a permanent plot in that area, and then we also, it was like 2 15 by 15 meter set squares, and we did one area that was seeded and one area unseeded, and then every 5 meters we put the hoop down and took pictures so that we could tell over time kind of how it was going. We went back in the spring this year, and nothing really seemed to take, so not much coverage has changed. So we're kind of assessing what to do now and how to move forward on that piece. Does that answer your question?
I'm muted here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, can hear you now.
Yeah, sorry. You know, that sort of answers the question. Did Flinnero provide the seed mix, or did you guys pick one to just try?
That is a good question. I'm not sure who supported that. We did pick up a bag of like Elk Valley specific mix, but I can't tell you. I'd have to look back. That was when Kendall was doing the budgets and figuring all that piece out, so I'm not sure who paid for it. Right. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, no, I was just mostly curious of the seed mix, because I mean, if it comes from Range Branch, then I probably have a pretty good idea what they're using there. But okay, anyways,
I can have a look. Like I can just have a look in the next few days and let you know what's in that mix, because I don't know off the top of my head.
Yeah, no worries, all good.
Okay,
cool. Thanks.
Yep. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Cool. All right, I will pass it off to Bailey now to do some invasive species ID.
Awesome. Thank you, Danny. And that was a lovely update, and it was good for me to hear as well. So I really enjoyed that. We're going to move on to a little bit of an invasive plants crash course. For those of you on this call, it might be a bit of review, so don't feel like you have to stick around. But for all those folks joining us on the recording, this is just going to take us right back to the basics of invasive plants and kind of why EKISC does what we do, working on some terminology, some plant characteristics, and then at the end, we'll be going over some identification to plant specific across the project area, and a little bit of reporting as well. So I'm going to hop on into it right away. So welcome to the Invasive Plants 101. We're going to start with some terminology so that we can learn a little bit more about how we talk about things in the invasive species world. So the first word I'm going to go over is native. So a native species is a species that has evolved with the ecosystem. They can be spotted by their usual lack of monocultures as they live in harmony with the plants around them. Ecosystems are dynamic. For example, alders pop up after a fire, are replaced by secondary succession trees, and so on, and may appear homogeneous depending on their stage of growth. So here's some pictures of some native species, such as the ponderosa pine, the Guernsey bear, and yarrow. Next up is non-native. So this is a species living outside of its native distributional range, which has usually arrived here through human activity, either deliberate or accidental, or maybe somehow in a migrating bird. It does happen. They don't necessarily take over an area though. Not all non-native plants are invasive. And then we have, of course, invasive, which Danny did cover at the very start as well. An invasive species is a non-native species that causes economic, social, or environmental harm. It can be one of these things or all three of these things, but this is essentially what makes an invasive an invasive. And then in the invasive world, we also have the term noxious weed. So a noxious weed is a term used by the BC Weed Control Act and regulations. It's an invasive species that has been designated as one that is injurious to agricultural or horticultural crops, natural habitats or ecosystems, and or humans or livestock. When a plant is designated as a noxious weed, it just allows for funding for specific plants to be removed. So moving back on to the three big impacts, let's talk about those just a little bit more. So the three big ones, let's start with economical. The official cost of invasive species is actually unknown. We don't quite have the data or reporting on this, especially when it comes to industries such as forestry or mining. It was an estimated $139 million in 2020, just in BC. And the annual loss in revenue in the agricultural and forestry industries is about 7.5 billion. Next up is environmental, of course. There's lots of different characteristics of invasive species that are environmentally harmful, whether that's habitat loss, which we're going to talk about in the next few slides, water quality, they threaten biodiversity for sure, they can introduce disease or be the disease, and they alter fire regimes. And next up is cultural. They reduce land and recreation opportunities and values, and this is both terrestrial and aquatic. They can cause income loss, reduce property values, something like Japanese knotweed is a big one that you hear about a lot. There's increased control and management costs. We know for sure that invasive species cost industry tens of thousands of dollars to survey, identify, and treat. And there is also export and import restrictions that are set, so makes trading a little bit more difficult globally. So how about those invasive impacts as well? The impact of invasive species on native ecosystems, habitats, and species is severe and often irreversible, but something that's really important to note is that it is preventable. It's something that we can do right now before it happens, which is pretty awesome that we can be proactive. According to the World Conservation Union, invasive alien species are the second most significant threat to biodiversity after habitat loss. In their new ecosystems, they can become predators, competitors, parasites, hybridizers, and diseases of our native and domesticated plants and animals. The important thing is that they can alter habitats and essential ecosystem functions. So this might be something like hydrology, nutrient cycling, contaminant absorption, fire regimes again, which is a big one, definitely top of mind after this summer, and can affect energy flows and cycles. So those essential ecosystem functions can be put at risk. And we just want to make sure that we keep those invasive species at bay so this doesn't happen. Another thing about invasive impacts is that it often takes several years before the extent of the problem is recognized. Not everything happens all at once, which we definitely know. And then as things start to pop up, it gets more and more obvious over time, especially with monocultures, and their effects are more realized. So let's talk a little bit more about this habitat loss. There's three different main types of habitat loss. So we're going to go over these just a little bit and why they're important, because invasive species play a part in almost all of these. Let's start with habitat destruction. So a little story. A bulldozer pushing down trees is the iconic image of habitat destruction, but some invaders can physically alter the habitat in addition to destruction. 50 beavers from Canada were relocated to the Tierra del Fuego, an archipelago at the southern tip of South America in 1946 to be hunted for their pelts. Since then, they have multiplied and now number in the hundreds of thousands. The trees in the region were not adapted to beaver activity as they are in North America, and most didn't grow back after being gnawed by beavers. So portions of formerly pristine forests now look like a bulldozer has plowed through them. Additionally, beaver activity creates ponds that flood portions of the forest. These bodies of stagnant water alter the nutrient cycle, and invasive plants thrive in them. They also build dams and drainage ditches of grasslands, and livestock commonly fall in where they become stuck. So it's not just other things coming from other places. Canada also provides to this global issue too, and it's not just plants as well, which is something to note. Habitat degradation, second on our list here. Pollution, invasive species, and disruptions of ecosystem processes, such as changing the intensity of fires, are some of the ways habitats can become so degraded they no longer support native wildlife. Invasive species on that list for sure. Habitat fragmentation, number 3. Much of the remaining terrestrial wildlife habitat in North America has been cut up into fragments by roads and development. Aquatic species habitat has been fragmented by dams and water diversions. These fragments of habitat may not be large or connected enough to support species that need a large territory in which to find mates and food. It can also make it difficult for migratory species to find places to rest and feed along their migration routes. So sometimes invasive species also can move right in when things are fragmented, especially when it comes to somewhere like roads. Invasive species really love disturbed areas. And 2 other terms that we can just cover real quickly, generalists versus specialists. So we have generalist species like raccoons who adapt to many environments, climates, and food sources. They are a jack of all trades. Invasive species are also generalists. That's what makes them so successful. And you'll see with some plants too, and we talked about characteristics, that some are able to make way anywhere. Think about the dandelion. It's not on the invasive species list, or sorry, not on the noxious weeds list anymore, but you can see them in the shade. You can see them in full sun. You can see them in wet places, dry places, you name it. They're really adaptable. So there's many different species of invasive plants that are like this, and invasive plant animals as well. And then we have specialist species. So like giant pandas, they require specific parameters and diet to survive. A lot of the time, our native species can be specialists. Some are generalists, but for sure, if something's meant to be in that area and adapted with it for thousands of years, they rely on that area being in harmony. So here's a few chosen main characteristics that I've picked out for you. We have a big long list, and we'll have some more in the next slide. The first one is that they lack predators, pathogens, and diseases. This allows them to outcompete native species that have been evolving with the ecosystem for a long time. So it also promotes the formation of monocultures, which you can see here on the right-hand side, this big, huge blue wheat field. You see this often in an infestation that gets out of control. Their seeds spread easily, either by wind or water, animals, clothing, and especially us. They establish quickly and thrive. Related to this, they are generalist plants that quickly establish and thrive in disturbed areas, and they're prolific producers and reproducers. They spread quickly, produce large amounts of seeds, and the seeds can remain viable in the soil for years or even decades for some plants. And just some other characteristics too that we can go over. They definitely outcompete native species, thrive in those disturbed areas, they form monocultures. Seeds are viable for many years, sometimes up to 60 I wrote on here. That's at the high end, but still for some, you know, in that 3 to 14 range even. Some of that phenotypic plasticity, so that's what I was talking about earlier with the dandelion. They can be habitat generalists that don't have specific growth requirements. Some are allelopathic. Spotted knapweed, which will be first up on our ID list, sends chemicals out into the soil and kills off their neighbors that way. And usually they have longer photosynthetic periods as well. So they can be the first to leaf out in the spring and last to drop leaves in autumn. With our changing climate, sometimes we're seeing, you know, maybe even a double bloom of some plants, so it can go to seed more than once. Here's some photos of monoculture, just so showing that lack of ecosystem biodiversity, how it can contribute to loss of food sources and habitats. It can become apparent in Western farming, how invasive species can introduce diseases and a lack of resilience in biodiversity as well. And just some photos of invasive species being opportunistic. Yeah, they definitely pop up in lots of different disturbed sites, maybe on roadways, your favorite trail, gravel pits, cut blocks. My neighbor's yard, I have a bunch of bindweed out in my yard right now that I've been pulling that's leaching in through the fence. Maybe the dog park, another prolific place for seeds and for invasive plants. So understanding that plants can spread either through seeds or plant parts might help you think of the ways in which plants are distributed. So let's talk first about vegetative reproduction. This is a process by which new plants are produced from plant parts other than seeds or spores. So it's both a natural process in many plant species and also one used by horticulturists to start new plants from existing plants. I do this when I break off a piece of succulent to give to my friends so it can grow a whole new one. Invasive species, many different types of plants can do this as well. They can come through parts of the roots or maybe even through the leaf parts. Examples of vegetative reproductive structures are rhizomes, which are the underground stems, and stolons, which are stems running along the surface of the ground. Plants that spread vegetatively by rhizomes and stolons usually produce dense and localized infestations nearby. They might also disperse greater distances if they're right near moving water or maybe carried to new locations by animals or in our tires. Usually plants that reproduce this way present really complex management challenges. For example, yellow toadflax plants produce rhizomes. So pulling toadflax is often ineffective because new plants can sprout out from where you pulled them up in the soil. And of course, seeds are another way that plants reproduce. They're uniquely designed for various means of dispersal. So some are light and feathery with structures that allow them to be carried by the wind. Others are prickly or sticky, or maybe even tasty. So they can be transported by attaching to an animal's fur or feet, or passing through their digestive tract. So plants that grow near water may also have seeds that are able to float until they land on a bank or shoreline. So you see these with a lot of aquatic plants as well. And of course, here's a picture of a dog with burrs on it. I know I spend a lot of this time of year pulling burrs off my long-haired border collies. So we definitely all deal with this, having them stuck to our pants as well. And I guess one more note on reproduction and spread is that some species are able to do both. They can be reproducing by vegetative reproduction or by seeds. So how can you prevent the spread? Like I said at the start, the amazing part about invasive species is that it's not all dire. It's something that we can prevent right now. So on our own small scales, the spread is totally preventable. So some of my favorite ways of preventing the spread are brushing your boots before leaving a site, maybe your work site, maybe a trail you were just on. Wash your truck or your car regularly. Especially if you're in an area with known prolific invasives. It's worth brushing or hosing down the tires and undercarriage before going out adventuring again. And of course, checking your pets for burrs and removing them carefully, clean, draining, and drying all the watercraft between water bodies. Don't let your old pets loose. For example, goldfish are extremely invasive, so it's sometimes more humane to, take them back to the pet store or using other means of getting rid of them. Only buy native plant species, and make sure if you're buying wildflower mixes that you check the back of the bag. If you contact a company, you can ask for a certification of a seed analysis, and they'll tell you really what's in there. A lot of the time it'll be friendly or, deer resistant. It's really important to check the backs of those bags to make sure that there's no invasive species to our area in there. Another one is buying local firewood, or burn it where you buy it, is the one here, or just making sure to gather it from around your campsite. My rule of thumb is no more than 50 kilometers from that site. There's specialist species, for instance, the gypsy moth that keeps its larvae in there, and it can do some serious damage to our forests. So let's talk a little bit about EKISC's management techniques. We have a few different ways that we manage invasive species on the landscape. The first, what you might see us out doing, our crews most often, or maybe you've participated in a weed pull before, is mechanical. So this is most often used in riparian zones in areas where herbicide is not an option, especially on bigger infestations, and is a viable method if plants have a taproot or do not spread by vegetative reproduction. So as making sure that we're doing more help than harm. And yeah, some methods like this might be weed whacking. It includes mowing and cutting, uprooting, and clipping as well. Our second method of control is cultural. So livestock and agriculture, revegetating or seeding with native species to compete with invasives. This is often combined with manual treatments as well. A fun one, of course, is the goats. We luckily got to do a pull with goats this year, lots of fun. Tillage, and yeah, this is pretty darn awesome. Goats can be trained to be selective, which is great, but a lot of testing is still happening as this is a new management method as well. And of course, chemical treatments, herbicide, different compounds for different species sometimes. There are specific chemicals available that can treat certain things, but at the end of the day, it's usually the most effective method, both cost and removal wise. On larger infestations, it just works. Biocontrol, generally used on smaller patches of weeds. It doesn't always eradicate the plant and only contains it. This is another awesome method of control. The only thing is that it can take up to 10 years to test. Usually it's very vigorously tested just to make sure that the biocontrol itself isn't going to become invasive. So on the left hand of the sides of the screen here, you can see the weevil that we use locally on some knapweed. And of course, education. This is our number one defense. If we can prevent before it happens, then we're doing our job here. So maybe this is in weed pulls, restoration projects, through interpretive signage, like we're hoping to do for the Elk Valley project. Maybe you've seen us at markets or schools, and definitely a way to build with the community. I mean, it's amazing to team up with other stewardship organizations or other community groups to host weed pulls or, create these types of projects moving forward. So our focus, of course, is on integrated management. We do our best to use whatever method is best for that site. It's often mostly site-specific, choosing what kind of mitigation techniques we are going to use. And I'll just briefly mention here, I won't get too much into this today. We do have more information about this on our website. So on top of our integrative management, we do management every area a little bit differently. And because we live in such a large region, we have a lot of different and diverse habitats here. So where there may be fields upon fields of blueweed near Kimberley, there might be a really limited amount in Invermere. And because we have so many microclimates as well across this expanse, different priority lists have to be followed to ensure that we're using the best management approach throughout each. So on the left-hand side here, you can see how we divvy up our areas. And of course, there's projects within each of these areas as well. Each management area, of course, has its own species list that's updated each year. The province also has their own list, so we work with both. And yeah, I'll just go over this quickly as well. Feel free to look this up on the website, starting with the reds. So 0 or and 0 star are prevention watch list. So if something's in the red zone, it's probably not known in the area, but might occur. Number 1 is regional EDRR, which is early detection rapid response. So these are high risk new invasives, 10 or less plants. And 1 is eradication. Maybe it's known, but super, super limited. Orange, number 2, these are our annual control plans. So these are known in the IPMA, but with limited distribution. Our goal is to monitor and decrease further spread. If you see a plant that's yellow or number 3 on our list, that's a containment plant. So these can be abundant in certain portions of an IPMA, but maybe limited in others, maybe like blueweed, like I just mentioned. So the goal is containment. And then we have green or number 4. This is established and widespread species that are beyond a landscape level control or have relatively low impact in that area. Of course, land managers might treat certain species as high priority. Say, for instance, if it's a wild habitat restoration site, something on our list might be green, but they might treat it as a higher priority if they're working in that area specifically. And then there's number 5, which is blue, and that just means we have insufficient information and we need further research for feasibility of control. So that's just a little look into how we divvy up things, how we decide what plant goes where. So moving along, what to do if you expect or suspect invasive plants. So my motto here is if it grows like a weed, it probably is a weed. But of course, you should check your guidebook before pulling anything out. Be suspicious of plants that seem to pop up out of nowhere. It's worth taking that couple minutes to look at it and see if it matches up with something in the Report Invasives app or another resource you might have. So what to do? Maybe you've looked it up and it is an invasive species. So reporting them is awesome. We'll go over it in the next slide, how you can do that and help us out. Or you can remove them. Maybe you know something like spotted knapweed. Feel free to pull it and bag it and bring it to the transfer station. Super duper helpful. Of course, if you don't necessarily know the plant and you're not sure if it's safe, definitely feel free to absolutely leave it there, as some can be toxic. So here is the Report Invasives app, just a little look. This is how you can report to us. So there are a few different things you can do. You can contact us through our website. You can contact us through IAP as well. If you're, for instance, a contractor or a land manager, you might be using IAP. But for the rest of us, we're going to be using Report Invasives app. So this works on Android and iPhone, super simple to download. And there's both plants and animals on here. It's a provincial public reporting system. So everything on here goes to a lovely lady named Judith Victoria, who scans through all the entries and then sends it out to us, which is awesome. It can also be used as a tool to identify plants. So when you download the app, you'll be able to come up to this window here. You can look through the app by color. So say, for instance, you find a blue flower, but you're not sure what it is. You can look up blue flowers. And on here, of course, we're pretending that we maybe see blueweed. You press on blueweed, it opens up a screen with photos so you can compare. And then you can report the weed right there in the app. And this gives us lots of information. You can give a photo, which is definitely recommended, the area of infestation, your name and email, and maybe any extra comments. It is really helpful to let us know maybe where the trailhead was that you were, as sometimes areas can't be super specific. The great thing about this app is that it will send it once you're back in service as well. So if you're somewhere out of service, which is a lot of places around here, this will make sure that we get that info once you're back in. Another app that I just like to mention in this presentation is iNaturalist, just because it's such a great identification app. It's also a community science app, which is awesome. I know some other invasive species groups use this for ID too. So definitely worth downloading if you don't have an app on your phone yet for ID. Yeah, and it helps us, explore the local area It helps maybe see if other people have noticed an invasive species within that area. And there are a lot of users actually across the East Kootenay region. So it's pretty awesome. You don't need an account. You can use their identification platform, which essentially you upload a photo and then it gives you some suggestions about what it could be. Yeah, it's pretty darn awesome. You don't have to post anything on there. It's just great to have. All right, so let's get on to the ID part. I have a few couple of chosen plants that we're going to cover today, and these are all specific to the area, the Elk Valley Project area as well. So we're going to start with two that are a little more prolific, and then we'll move on to a few other ones. So we're going to start with spotted knapweed. And of course, as I say this and we go through some identifying features, you're welcome to report them anywhere across the region that you see them, not just, of course, in the Elk Valley. So let's start with spotted knapweed. Probably one of the most popular, at least in Kimberley, in my region. Most people know this one. It's a household name. Spotted knapweed has one flower head on each of the branch, and they're purpley pink, usually brighter pink color, at least around here. Their most identifying feature to other knapweeds or flowers is that their bracts, so the part that goes underneath the flower, has dark spots on the tips. So you might not be able to see it super well, unfortunately, in these photos I've chosen, but in the middle one, you can see the one without the flower head, how it's sort of this bulb shape, that's the bract. It'll have little dark spots on all the little tips on there, so that's its key feature. They grow up to 120 centimeters tall and are highly branched. The leaves are finely divided into linear segments, as you can see on the right-hand side. These guys do have a taproot, which makes them a lot easier to pull as well, which is nice. They're allelopathic, so they will kill other plants all around it through the soil. And luckily, this one also only reproduces through seed. So if it's not in flower and not gone to seed yet, this is a super great plant to focus on for a community weed pull, as it's safe to pull. I guess I have a fun fact on here. It says it has a bitter taste. So don't feel like you gotta bite into this one. Don't bite into most plants, please, but I have tried for you and it's very bitter.
Sorry, just a quick question there, Bailey, about knapweed. Is it, how long does the seed last on the ground, or like its viability?
That's a very good question. I actually don't have that in my notes here, and I don't know off the top of my head. If Danny's still on here and knows, she's welcome to pop on in.
Because like you say, I'm mostly in Kimberley. I'm thinking about that in my own area. There's tons of knapweed, and I've been pulling the last couple of years, and I just keep wondering, like, oh God, is it ever gonna end? And like, does mowing it also beneficial, basically, as far as, I guess, as long as it's not flowering, if you get it before it flowers, is that an effective way of sort of reducing its numbers?
Absolutely, just because it won't produce more, as long as it's not in flower yet, you can definitely mow it down if you like, especially, yeah, I've seen how big the infestations get around here. I'm in Kimberley too, so they're definitely a long-term battle, like most invasives are.
Yeah, for sure. Cool, thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Just on the seed note, I don't have my books in front of me, but I want to say about 3 years they've remained viable in the soil. It could be potentially a bit longer. So your comment is, is it ever gonna stop? Is probably not, depending on the size of the seed bank, really, and the size of the infestation. Sorry, Mark.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's one of these ones where it's like the properties on, you got, highway stuff that's right beside my house. It's just like, yeah, it's one of those things. It's just crazy. And then once they're in, my experience with them, it's hard to get rid of. So, but I've been wondering, I guess, yeah. And like you said, I've actually been doing a lot of hand seeding. I've been trying to basically create some competition for it. But I also wonder, like, almost like what you said, as to whether or not it's affecting the soil around it, so therefore the other seed's not really maybe taking as well either. So I don't know. Yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah, well, I'd love to hear if you are reseeding, if anything is effective in kind of beating it to the punch, if it is in the soil there. And yeah, it does have that allelopathic trait, but I'm definitely would love to hear more about if reseeding's working in the future.
Fair enough. Good job. Keep going.
All right, next up we have scentless chamomile. So spotted knapweed and scentless chamomile have higher densities in the Elk Valley project area, but are still being 100% targeted. So we'll talk a little more about this, another great one to report. Yeah, scentless chamomile has a daisy-like flower. Sometimes the petals turn downward like a badminton birdie, which is one way to also tell it apart from the oxeye daisy. They can be 5 centimeters to a meter tall, so lots of variation. They have fern-like scentless leaves, hence its name, scentless chamomile. When it is in rosette form, its fern-like leaves can look like, gosh, what's that one called? The pineapple weed as well. And it does have fibrous root, which makes it a bit more difficult to pull. Here is an oxeye daisy leaf just to show the comparison, as they are both invasives and both look super similar if you don't know what you're looking for. So yeah, on the left, you can see those fern, almost dill-like leaves versus oxeye daisy, which has that big broad leaf. So here I have the two knapweeds, or sorry, yeah, the two hawkweeds. I put them both on the same slide, just since they both kind of share a name. So the first one's first, yellow on the left-hand side. There are actually about 28 types of hawkweed found in North America, but only around 14 of these are native varieties. Yellow hawkweed is widespread. However, we did begin treatments on most of the sites in the Elk Valley Project this year. They usually have 5 to 30 brilliant yellow flowers, can be 30 to 90 centimeters tall. They have bristly hairs as well, up and down the stem, and shallow fibrous roots, which makes them difficult to remove. I like to call these guys the lanky dandelion. Even though they have more than one flower head at the top, I find they look super similar to me, except extremely long stem most of the time compared to dandelion. On the right-hand side here, we have orange hawkweed. So not as widespread in the Elk Valley Project zone, but it has been recently spotted in the area, and I am noticing this plant more and more around our region as well. So definitely worth reporting if you see it, as it might be new to that site. A 1 meter square patch of orange hawkweed can produce over 40,000 seeds per year, which is pretty crazy. The plants can be removed by digging up the rosette plants over many years, but we find that mechanical removal is fairly ineffective of this plant. So you have to be careful not to break the roots to ensure the entire plant is removed to prevent plant regrowth from the bits left over. So chemical is usually the best way to treat these plants, makes it more efficient to remove them. And here we have Dalmatian toadflax. So we only have a few sites of this in the Elk Valley Project area. So we ask that you please report this if you do see it. It's quite a unique plant. Once you know it and see it in real life, you'll definitely be able to ID it in person most of the time. Dalmatian toadflax was brought over as an ornamental plant. It's a snapdragon type of plant. They have a pretty long flowering period, generally May to August. Their mature plants can produce up to 500,000 seeds and remain viable in the soil for up to 10 years. So we really want to nip this one in the bud. They're waxy and dense, which makes them hard to treat chemically as well. And yeah, if you touch them, you can actually feel how waxy and dense they are compared to other plants. They have vertical roots, which are large, rough, and somewhat branching, and they might extend down 6 feet or more. They also have long, slender lateral roots that branch out, that are vertical, and can extend out 10 feet or more. So generally you can find that they come in these dense clusters and stay pretty close to one another, but they do shoot out quite quickly each year if they're not dealt with quickly. Isolated plants can be dug up fairly effectively if the soil is not too hard or rocky. However, new shoots will resprout from any remaining roots left in the soil. So we definitely have to be careful when managing this guy. So absolutely report it if you see it, or even if you think you see it, it's worth sending us a photo. And up here is St. John's wort. This is another one with limited distribution across the project area, but we do want to make sure it gets reported if it's seen. St. John's wort is a perennial plant that grows in dense patches, which can crowd out natural plants and reduce the grasses that animals feed on. So we see them in pastures quite often. They're most found in southern BC. They spread through lateral roots and can spread up to 10,000 seeds per plant. They grow 0.3 of a meter to 1 meter in height and have these dark green leaves, which show tiny transparent dots when held up to the light. Quite a unique leaf pattern if you see over in the right-hand photo at the top there. Their flowers are bright yellow with 5 petals each. So I find them most easy to identify during flowering time as they kind of look like a star to me, at least. And the flowers grow in clusters at the top of the branches. The plant turns a rusty red color after finishing flowering in the late summer and in autumn. So starting around this time, you'll see that they will start to turn more rusty red. Hand pulling or digging St. John's wort before the flowers go to the seed can reduce the spread of this plant. Remove as much of the root system as possible to help prevent regrowth if you are manually removing it. I do have a note here at the bottom that St. John's wort does contain a poison that can cause light-colored farm animals that eat it to have skin burns or blisters when exposed to sunlight. So just being careful, especially when transporting St. John's wort, make sure it's completely bagged up, especially when traveling down highways or near any livestock or other habitats. And then we have blueweed. Definitely, if you're in this part of the Kimberley-Cranbrook area, you will have seen this. Jaffrey also has quite a bit of blueweed, and it's starting to make its way over that way too. This is another plant with limited distribution in the area. We definitely want to know if there's any reported sightings of this throughout the Elk Valley. Blueweed sort of can look like lupin a little bit. It's kind of like the ugly cousin, I would call it. It has blue, purple, or pink flowers. Most of the ones I see are that rich blue purpley color with a little pink kind of middle to it. The stem can be up to 90 centimeters tall. I've seen some almost as tall as me though, and I'm 5'6", so they can grow pretty darn tall, but usually 90 centimeters or under. You will notice that the stems have red or really dark spots on them. Most of the ones I've seen have black spots, so that's a really key identifying feature. Is if you look at the stem, it'll be covered in these stiff hairs. I definitely recommend wearing gloves for that reason if you are handling it, because they can be kind of pokey. But yeah, they have these stiff hairs and these dark spots all up and down the stem. Their rosette can also be fairly identifiable once you know what you're looking for. It has these long, slender basal leaves. So the leaves are 1 to 15 centimeters long, and they grow in this super circular pattern. And they do have a larger, deep taproot. So if you're manually pulling these by hand, I definitely recommend bringing a really good spade or maybe one of those weed dagger things, because holy moly, their taproot can get really deep and really thick down there and hard to pull out. But they are another great one for community weed pulls, etc. So definitely report this guy if you see it. Super helpful to us. Next up, another limited distribution plant in that area is common tansy. This has definitely come over as an ornamental plant. You see them in a lot of bouquets. So if you do get a bouquet with this, please don't compost it and throw it in the garbage. They're pretty identifiable once they're in flower. They usually have 20 to 200 yellow-orange button-like flower heads that grow in these dense clusters, usually 30 centimeters to 1.8 meters tall. The stem is often woody or robust. So if you rub it between your fingers, you'll be able to feel that it's woody or robust. And it has these alternating leaves that are consistent in size all the way up the plant that are fern-like. Common tansy also has a really strong scent. So if you're unsure, definitely can give it a sniff, and if it has a strong scent, it'll help you on your identifying journey. And last but not least on our list for this evening is caraway. This is another plant that has limited distribution, so we just wanted to mention it to make sure we have reports if it is seen. White plants are, of course, always harder to identify. They have these white, sometimes pinkish grouped flowers, 60 to 90 centimeters tall. They have a parsnip-like taproot as well. And one of the identifying features is that the taproot has black skin, but has a white core. So if you snip through it, it'll help you ID it as well. A little bit more harder to ID when not in flower, just because lots of different plants look like this, but it's, always worth taking a photo. Getting a really good photo of those leaves is also really helpful. So yeah, pretty densely found in the Elk Valley, but limited distribution in the project area and across the rest of East Kootenay. So it does remain a high priority in most of the region as well. And yeah, that's all I have for you guys. If anyone's left out there, you're welcome to ask any more questions. Or maybe if you think of something later, please feel free to pop an email to that email as well, and get in touch. Thank you guys for listening, and hopefully there was something you could take away from that. And yeah, hope you have a lovely, lovely evening. Let us know if you have any more questions about the Elk Valley project itself or about Plant ID.